Welcome back to part 3 of the Macau Handover series. And in the first two parts, we talked about the history of Macau from 1500 to roughly the Cultural Revolution. We discussed a little bit about the 12-3 incident, where a riot in Macau went out of control and resulted in a humiliating public apology from Portugal and a secret agreement that basically established the sovereignty of China over Macau and set the tone for future talks on a potential handover. At the time, Salazar, who was the anti-communist Portuguese prime minister, did not really see surrendering Macau in 1966 as an option. But he died a few years later, and with him so did the right-wing new state regime that ruled Portugal. So in 1974, Portugal saw its own revolution, the Carnation Revolution, named after the carnation flowers people pinned on the soldiers in the streets. Lisbon embarked on a new decolonization policy that would see it give up all of its African colonies, like right then. This would have a devastating side effect for the Portuguese economy, as hundreds of thousands of Portuguese would return to the motherland, flooding the economy with excess labor and overcrowding the nation, basically their economy. Meanwhile, the abrupt withdrawal would trigger regional conflicts in the colonies themselves. It was good times. And I think a lot of people actually in Portugal later on would resent the left for this abrupt decolonization policy, even though I think they had, the best of intentions at heart. So the Portuguese had bigger fish to fry, and Macau was essentially a bother. Britain fought for Hong Kong not only for its wealth and economic value, but also because Hong Kong was a vestige of the glory of the British Empire. Portugal let go long ago of these sentimentalities. The new left-wing government was more in line ideologically with the Chinese, which made China more willing to talk to them. So in 1974, a high-level Portuguese minister visited Macau and met with Chinese officials and elites. During these meetings, Portugal offered to withdraw. The twist, though, is that the Chinese responded that they did not wish to alter Macau's status as a foreign administered territory. The newspapers went nuts. Hong Kong tabloids pronounced "China does not want Macau" in great big bold headlines, elaborating that the colonies were more valuable as sources of information, trade, and hard currency for China than they would be if they were a part of China. Portuguese government officials would go on the record and deny that this exchange ever took place. However, researchers and historians largely conclude that it did, and yes indeed, the Chinese did turn down their offer. The question was why, and there were 3 big reasons. The first was domestic. China was dealing with stuff. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, founders and key statesmen of the PRC, were dying. China was gearing up for a power struggle, and dealing with Macau and Hong Kong would be a distraction. The second reason was economic. Macau and Hong Kong represented ways for China to get around its closed-door policy towards the rest of the world. Indeed, at the time, Hong Kong was China's top source of a hard Western currency, with some $500 million worth flowing across China's borders each year from Hong Kong alone. In this case, the sensational newspapers were correct. The third reason was most interesting. Chinese officials judged the timing as inappropriate. Recovering Macau right then and there would marginalize the British and jeopardize Hong Kong's economic future. It would also greatly unsettle Taiwan. The party's number one priority at the time was to recover, or to take over depending on your perspective, Taiwan Island. In China's eyes, Macau and Hong Kong would be recovered only after the Taiwanese reunification. 2 years later, though, China softened a bit, and its first negotiations on the handover began in January 1978 in Paris. The Portuguese came into the negotiations with no overarching strategy other than to return Macau to the Chinese. In light of the unique circumstances, the 3 that I mentioned above, though, China did not want Portugal to simply up and leave right then and there. So the Portuguese actually had quite a bit of leverage. A savvy politician could have run great concessions from China, like partial democratization or continued administration in Macau for decades to come. At the very least, they could have at least tried to get the Macanese people a seat at the table so that they can determine their own future. But instead, a secret agreement was signed. the Acta Secreta, or the secret memo. Portugal opened the barn door and gave away the horse, and the barn too. They promised to return Macau to China, full stop. Nothing else needed to be decided other than when to do the ceremony. China had what it wanted. In 1986 and 87, another round of talks were held. Reeling from the trauma of the unpopular 1974 African decolonization, Portugal wanted a more honorable withdrawal from Macau, but that window had already closed. All they could do was to formalize the terms of the 1978 secret agreement. By now, the inevitable was clear. In light of Portugal's agreeableness, though, China would grant the Macanese two unique concessions that it would not grant to the Hong Kongers. First, the Chinese wanted the Macau handover to happen simultaneously with the Hong Kong handover. But Portugal wanted to keep Macau into the 21st century, preferably to 2007, the 450th year anniversary of the Portuguese presence in Macau. 2007 was out of the question, though, because the Chinese committed themselves to get their colonies back before 2000. But in a nice concession, they did delay the handover until December 1999, 2.5 years after the 1997 Hong Kong handover, so that was nice. The second concession, though, is more major. During the Hong Kong handover, the United Kingdom issued national passports, which are called passports but really aren't, because they do not grant the right to work or abode in the United Kingdom. A lot of Hong Kongers do not take kindly to this. Portugal, on the other hand, granted, against London's urgings by the way, full Portuguese passports to the Macanese, along with full rights of abode and residency in Portugal. And since Portugal was in the European community at the time, this would also grant the Macanese abode rights in the rest of the EC. The problem, though, is that China does not allow for dual citizenship. So what would happen to the Macanese who have Portuguese citizenship rights? Would they get invalidated? Would China take away their passports? In the end, China did not do that. They simply let people hold on to both. And this was a significant concession. These concessions happened because, 1. Macau was so small in both population and economy, and 2. Because relations between the Chinese and the Portuguese were free and clear tension. The Chinese knew that they were negotiating from a position of strength and felt comfortable enough to grant concessions to help everyone save face. China recovered Macau long before 1999. It was only a matter of when the flags would switch over. The Portuguese were nowhere near as powerful as the British, nor did Macau matter as much as Hong Kong did to both parties. So the handover went over smoothly, and both Portugal and China got what it wanted. Portugal got to depart in Macau without a loss of face, and China got back one more colony. The ultimate prize, though, the reason why the handover with Macau was delayed for so long, remained out of reach. Taiwan continues to govern itself, and as long as that remains the case, China's policy of national reunification continues on.